Welcome to Firsts in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write fantastic fiction. I'm your host, Aaron Gansky, author of The Bargain, The Hand of Adonai series, and Firsts in Fiction.
And good evening. I'm Alton Gansky from up in Central California, the co-host today, and I'm the author of about 45 books.
And with us today, we have Jennifer Kincheole. Did I say that right?
Kincheole.
You just told me Kincheole. You told me last night, and I completely
okay.
messed it up. I apologize. Jennifer Kincheole, author of The Secret Life of Anna Blanc, and she's joining us to talk about redeeming flawed characters. So, Jennifer, why don't you tell our listeners just a little bit about yourself?
Secret Life of Anna Blanc is my debut novel. It's coming out 1 week from today from 7th Street Books, so it should be available everywhere. I just heard it's going to be available in Waterstones in England, which made me happy. It's the story of a young socialite in 1907 Los Angeles who buys off her chaperone and, using an alias, secretly gets a job as a police matron with the LAPD. So it's a historical mystery, and yeah.
And is it a
Sounds
doctor?
very, very intriguing.
Did I read that you have a PhD?
I do. I have a PhD in public health.
Well, there you go.
Yeah. But I'm not doing that right now. But yeah, so I was on the research faculty at UCLA for 11 years, and I left to write my book. So
Nice. So you're one of those high achievers, I see. So
yeah.
The PhD, does that stand for public health degree? Is that what that is?
No. Doctorate in philosophy.
Oh, I thought it meant piled higher and deeper, but
That sounds right.
Well, that's great. That's great. Well, we are super excited to have you on here talking about a topic that I've always been interested in, and it's always been near and dear to my heart. So I'm looking forward to our conversation. But before we jump into that, Pops, you've got a publishing term for the week?
I do, and the term is a sell-through. Once you get your book published, as we just heard about Jennifer doing, one of the things you'll hear from time to time is sell-through. It's a business term, and in publishing what it means is how many books were actually sold not to the bookstore but through the bookstore. That is, customers came in, put down the cold hard cash, and walked off with your book, and that's called sell-through. Depending on the publisher, they try to keep those numbers monthly, and they'll ask what the sell-through is on this title and on this title and those kinds of things with it. The other word that goes with it is the sell-in, and when the book salespeople go to the bookstores, they try to sell in your book, but that doesn't mean that you're getting any money out of it yet, because that book has to be bought by a customer first. So there's a sell-through that they're looking for. So it's really true for many products, but it is a term that's used a lot in publishing. Sell-through.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you for that, Pops. I don't think I've heard that one, so that's a new one for me too. I need to start keeping a notebook of all these. So that's good stuff. So we are talking today about redeeming flawed characters, and you hear that term a lot in writing classes, that our characters need to be flawed in some way. Jennifer, do you want to just kind of tell us a little bit about what you mean by a flawed character, and how can we write a character with flaws?
Sure. You're getting my viewpoint as an author, because I'm not an MFA person. So in my experience, a flawed character is a real human being. We all have our flaws, and it makes us interesting, it makes us endearing and lovable, and in fiction it makes us believable, or it makes the characters believable to the reader. What was the second part of that question? How do we make one?
Yeah, what is it? How do you give your characters flaws? I guess if I can go a little bit off script here, and Pops, you may want to weigh in on this. The question always becomes, I know my character needs to be flawed, So what flaws do I give them? Now, do you just like have a book, like a notebook full of flaws, or do you research it online and go, okay, I'll take this one and this one and this one and throw it into my character? Or do you have more of an organic approach to that? So Pops, I'll ask you first, and then Jennifer, do you guys pull from a list? Is there a list that you pull from, or do you do this more organically, the flaws kind of arising from the characters themselves?
Yes, I do use a list. It's the list your mother keeps of my flaws, and so I just apply them to the characters, and it usually works out quite well.
So
No,
you've got
I don't have a
you've
list.
got an Indeed.
What's that?
I was going to say, so your list just goes on and on and on, so you can have flawed characters for days.
Yeah, it's kept my career going for 20 years. So, no, I often start my books with a character in mind. Sometimes I don't even have a plot before I begin thinking about these things, and a character will come to mind. And in most cases, depending on the genre I'm writing in, but in most cases there'll be some kind of flaw, some pain, some drawback, some weakness, some thing they have to get over, some other issue that they have to deal with while dealing with the problem of the book. And it varies widely. I've had characters that were borderline insane, and then I've had those that are just manic depressive, and some just almost suicidal, and then others who just can't do things that other people do, but they excel at other stuff. So no list. Usually the character tells me, which I know sounds weird, but as the character begins to develop, I begin to see these things.
Okay, excellent. So it is a little more organic for you then.
Yes.
How about you, Jennifer? Is that something that you maybe you make your own list, or is it just kind of like Dad says, you just have a organic approach to it?
For me, it's definitely organic. I had read about the first female police officer in Los Angeles in 1910, and I originally started to write a story about, really inspired by her and her character, and the character that came out was so different from that and much more flawed than I imagined this real-life woman to be, and she just kind of flowed off my fingertips. And when I look back, after having finished the book on her character, I see she's 19 years old, and I see she has a lot of the flaws that I had when I was 19 years old, only they're sort of blown up. So they're more dramatic in her. But I definitely didn't have a list.
All right, so I'm the only guilty one here. I tend to, with my protagonists, I typically will know their shortcomings and their flaws. But sometimes with my auxiliary characters, I have to struggle a little bit more to figure out what it is that makes them tick. Sometimes I make a character just based on their flaw. I think of the one-legged waitress in The Bargain, and that was something that kind of a bit of a character flaw for her, because she had this thing and she was kind of bitter about it a little bit. But that became something that reoccurred and almost became a strength for the character. So I'm usually organic with my protagonists. It's just for my secondary characters, I'll find myself sometimes going, okay, what's something new that I can do here, something that's beyond my realm of experience. So I have researched some things online, but I don't have a master list that I plug and play. So why is it important for our characters to be flawed? Why can't we just have the perfect character? And Pops, I'll ask you, and then I'll see, Jennifer, if you have something to add to that.
Well, if your character is perfect, he or she is not believable. It's just hard to root for somebody who has no flaws, who is superhuman. Even in the world of comics, that was a problem initially for Superman. I mean, if you couldn't shoot him, you couldn't beat him up, you couldn't outrace him. There's no flaw whatsoever, and that made him less a person than if he had some flaws. And then later they begin to introduce like a love interest, and they introduce kryptonite, and they do those kinds of things to show some weaknesses. Or there was even a time when he was subject to magic way back. And it's because when you have somebody who is perfect, the reader is not going to be able to relate to them. And life is pretty much a struggle. We're overcoming one thing after another as we go along. So when we read, we want to see someone else be able to do that too. even if they have problems we're never likely to face.
Right. How about you, Jennifer? Is that kind of the same thing, or did you have something to add?
No, absolutely. But I would also say sometimes in real life, if someone appears very perfect, we either don't trust them or we hate them because their life seems so perfect. I hear it a lot from my daughter who's in high school. But I think even more importantly is that they're just not believable. You can't relate to them, and you don't believe them.
I agree, and I think it's important to be able to relate to them. But I also think that the term "goody two shoes" exists for a reason. There, people who are inherently flawed don't like people who are not, and so if you're perfect, you might have one or two friends, maybe, but they probably secretly resent you behind your back. I mean, that's the story of my life. It's hard to keep friends. I'm reaching a little too far. I don't know why you guys are laughing. Is that a punchline? So. So we do need to have flawed characters, and I think that as writers, most of our listeners understand that already. But one thing that's, I guess, always been a point of interest for me is what flaws to give them. You don't want to give them something that just seems kind of tacked on. You want to give them something that feels organic and natural. But is there a particular group of flaws that you find really work well in fiction? And then later on, I'll ask about if there are any we should avoid. But what, in your experience, Pops, writing as many novels as you have, what types of flaws do you think make the best characters that really seem to work well? And then Jennifer, I'll ask you the same thing.
I think a lot of it has to do with internal flaws. I've used external flaws too for supporting protagonists and the like. But we all struggle with self-doubt to some degree or another. Some more than others, and it's always refreshing to see someone overcome their self-doubts or their weaknesses. An example might be Hemingway's Old Man and the Sea, where the fisherman is really too old to be doing the work. He's considered too old to be teaching his protege, the boy, and he hasn't been catching any fish. So he's flawed in those areas, and so when he does catch the gigantic fish on the hand line and brings it in and overcomes the sharks and everything else, he's a real hero. And we see that even old men and their flaws can still have victories in their lives. So again, I let the characters show me their flaws as time goes on, and sometimes I don't know until I'm well into the book that I realize there's something eating this person. There's something that he or she has not told me.
Good. So those internal flaws really go a long way. How about for you, Jennifer? Is it the internal flaws, or do you have some sort of external flaws as well?
He means your characters, not you.
Thank you. Yeah. Appreciate the clarification.
Well, when you say internal flaws, what do you mean when you say external flaws?
Something that would be on the outside, perhaps some sort of disability, physical disability, some sort of a biological illness, or even mental. Well, I guess mental illness might be considered more interior. They suck at computers. I don't know, something that's kind of out the outside, rather than having something inside of them that they need to overcome, some sort of flaw that prevents them from doing something outwardly.
I think some outward flaws can make a character more endearing. Like, I don't know, I haven't sat down and categorized my flaws according to that. But if you have messy hair all the time, or you're a little socially awkward, or you get the hiccups easily. Some of these exterior flaws can make characters endearing. So internal flaws, I think they make characters relatable because we all have our own flaws. So I don't think about it when I'm writing. I just write my character.
You just kind of let it happen naturally.
I just let it happen naturally. I don't think about or organize my flaws, but I do think somebody who struggles with money management, or who is really jealous, or Um, those kind of things can make a character more interesting and also relatable.
I agree. I like what you say about the chronic hiccups. I want to write about a character who chronically has the hiccups. I think that's fantastic and really annoying too. But I'll probably have them before the night is over. But you make a good point about not organizing your flaws. I tried to organize mine, but it was taking way too long. So after 3 or 4 months, I gave up and decided to move on. So now we've talked about what some flaws that work well, the internal flaws, and some of these kind of maybe some external flaws. You mentioned social, not really social anxiety, but maybe some missing some social cues or social awkwardness. Being awkward in front of the opposite sex. I think of what is it, Raj from Big Bang Theory, who in the early seasons couldn't talk to women unless he was drunk.
Right.
So that's that endears us to him as a character, and kind of makes us feel empathy for them. But there are probably some flaws that we might want to avoid. I mean, I'm just trying to think of somebody who just chronically murders people. That's a bad habit, and it's going to be hard to relate to them. So, is there some sort of pops? Are there any flaws that you think are kind of like gray areas, dark areas? You don't want to approach those that might somehow set off the readers. And then Jennifer, I'll ask you the same thing.
Well, there are some, and since I write primarily for the Christian market, there's a few taboos that we stay away from because it sometimes upsets the readers, and they return the books, and that upsets the bookseller who returns the books to the publisher, and that upsets the publisher, and then they yell at us, and that upsets the writer. So it's not as big a problem as I'm making it sound, but those are things I do factor in. There's some things that I want to stay away with. And it used to be in television, in movies, and in books, you never killed a kid. That was just something you never, ever did. That was just too much, they thought, for the viewers or the readers and stuff. Well, that's unfortunately been changing. But I tend to stay away from those kinds of things, mostly not for literary reasons, but because of what it does to me. So that's just not something I want to face. And I've written a lot of suspense, supernatural suspense. So I've written some pretty ugly things. But I might have a child in danger, but you can bet I'm not going to kill the kid off. That and my wife would kill me. So. So to keep peace in the family. So there probably are some things, but it might be a very personal choice for the writer.
Yeah. And I think it has, like you say that you write for the Christian market, which shows an awareness of your audience. I think you need to be aware of who's reading your book, who you're writing your book for, because some readers are going to have more taboos than others. I've read Jesus' Son by Dennis Johnson, and the whole thing's told from the perspective of a drug addict, and it's completely strung out the entire time. And there's even a scene, I guess a story in there where he's thinking about sneaking in and into this woman's house and doing some pretty unspeakable things to her. And the story is just full of tension. That's a pretty big character flaw. I mean, somebody who's thinking about doing something so horrendous and awful definitely does not endear the reader to him in any way. But it ended up having a strange effect in the sense that you end up empathizing more with this woman who actually never speaks, but you get to see her life through her windows because of this creepy peeping Tom. And so the reader develops this bond with this woman, this unnamed woman, and they end up starting to root for her. Spoiler alert, he ends up just getting on the bus and going home, and he doesn't do anything. So there's that moment of relief, and that tension is lifted, and you're proud, I guess, that he's made the right decision. You're happy that he's made the right decision, but you're also still a little bit terrified and grossed out by him. So I think it's really hard to do a flaw like that where the character is just completely unrelatable and doesn't appeal to us at all. So I would say be wary of that. I don't know, Jennifer, are there any others that you have some interesting thoughts on this? Because you said when we talked about this earlier that you think it's different for men and women.
I do. I think that in our society we like well-behaved women. We look for sweet and good in our female characters. Now, that's not across the board, and but you will lose some readers if they buy into that paradigm of women being, in order for a character to be likable, if she's a woman, then she needs to be sort of toe the line. Now, in my opinion, a character doesn't have to be likable to be interesting and to have a great book. But I was thinking about, you were talking about unspeakable things, and one of the most unspeakable things is child abuse and molesting children, and yet Nabokov wrote Lolita, and it's considered one of the greatest books of the 20th century, and he pulls it off. He pulls it off. We stay with the book. I think one of the dangers when you have a flawed character is that the reader will stop rooting for them, and they'll stop caring or even hope for that character's demise and put the book down. So he gets away with it, I think, one, because he's a master. I think it would be really hard to have, and he's writing literature, not genre fiction. But also he has an unreliable narrator, and so we're seeing the world through the protagonist's eyes and sort of seeing his perspective even as we're cringing. I think it would be a lot harder to get away with a child molester female character in a book than it is a male character. I just think we're more comfortable with flaws in men.
When you were saying that, because I was reading some of the notes that you made, and my first inclination was, well, I don't know that I necessarily agree with that. But as I kind of read through your notes, and you pulled some quotes from what people had said about Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind and how they treated her, and I was a little convicted because I remember loving Star Trek growing up, but they always had some woman character who wanted to take on the whole world and show that she was, as strong as any man, and it always felt like she was trying too hard. Right. And I found myself being very, very critical of those characters, not liking those characters. But when you've got, an admiral who's in charge and commands and stuff, I still don't like the police lieutenant who's trying so hard to assert his power and dominance and all that kind of stuff. Or I guess captain. I guess the lieutenant wouldn't be doing that. But I tend not to like them male or female. But I think I may be a little bit more critical when it's in a female character. So I was a little bit convicted when you started talking about that. Pops, do you find that that's true in your reading of books or in your writing of books? Are you there, Pops? Did I lose Pops? Jennifer,
oh no!
No, come back to me. Come back to me. We have had so many. I just want to apologize to the room. We've had so many technical issues tonight. So we're going to assume that he's going to pop up, and we're going to assume that he completely agrees with us because we are brilliant.
Well, let me read some Scarlett O'Hara quotes from Goodreads.
Please do. Yeah, absolutely.
So I think Scarlett is a great, interesting character. She's iconic. She has a lot of flaws, but she has redeeming aspects too. She's charming, she's beautiful, she's courageous. She passionately loves Ashley, who really doesn't return her love. But she doesn't meet society's ideal of womanhood. She isn't sweet, and she's certainly not selfless. She's very, very selfish. So some readers, or maybe even most readers, say, wow, how interesting. But, there's a group of readers who hate the book because Scarlett isn't the feminine ideal. And I have some quotes from Goodreads, and these just go on and on and on and on and on. Scarlett was far too annoying for me to ever like the book. I did, however, love Melanie. And if you all remember, Melanie was amazing. She was an angel. She wasn't just sweet and good. She was an incredible symbol of love and sweetness. So someone else says, I hate the characters except Melanie. Melanie was the sweetest person I've ever read about. She's the true heroine of the story. She's the one who teaches Scarlett how to love. Melanie is the only character who has any redeeming value. Scarlett has no redeeming qualities whatsoever. I couldn't get into the novel when I saw the story through the eyes of such an odious person. So, and these quotes go on, and I just find it very interesting that readers can't say, wow, Scarlett is this brave, strong, courageous, interesting character. They're too put off by the fact that she's selfish.
So selfishness then may be one of those flaws that readers don't really like. It's possible, like you say, to be a good character and still be selfish, but I think that we can be very judgmental of selfish people. So perhaps that's a flaw. Yeah, we could continue talking about the gender aspect of it for quite some time, but I do want to get to the redemption part, because this is what really excited me. So every character needs to be flawed. Does every character need to be redeemed? But before we can kind of get into that, I guess our first question is what do you mean, Jennifer, when you say redemption?
Well, I thought of it in two different ways. First, you have to make the character palatable so that the reader will root for them, and you need to do that, or the writer needs to do that from the beginning. So so that's one form of redemption, and things that have worked well, I think, for me is make the character very, very good at something. So if they have a severe flaw, like being self-absorbed, which happens to be one of my female characters' flaws, she's very, very good at being a detective. If you make your character passionate, if they care very much about something, whatever it is, catching the criminal or someone that they love, then the reader cares more and they're more likely to stick with the book. I also think you can get away, redeem the character somewhat by establishing historical context. And I think about Outlander. I don't know if you guys have read Outlander, but it was a very best-selling novel, and it's a romance novel. The male lead, Jamie, actually rapes and beats his wife, and yet he's the hero of the story. But the way the author delivers up this story, it's very much within the cultural context, and we don't end up hating him, which is very artful. You have to be very good to pull that off. And then the last thing I think about is if your flawed character is a victim or they've suffered in some way, then, and especially if this suffering sort of explains their flaws, then I think that readers are more willing to take them as a whole package and stick with the character. The second kind of redemption is the whole character arc idea, where a character actually changes, becoming a better person through the course of the novel. So in that case, it's really the character arc is integral to the plot, and the characters actually, who they are and who they become is revealed as a protagonist reacts to situations. So you put them in a crisis and they may discover new virtues or resources within themselves. So those are two sort of aspects of redemption that I think about when I'm writing.
Absolutely. Pops, welcome back. We lost you for a minute. We missed you, but I'm glad to see you're back. We were just talking about redeeming our characters, and in what way can we redeem our characters? Is there a particular strategy that you have, some sort of formula that you ascribe to in terms of redemption, or do you kind of just let that happen, again, organically from the context of the novel? How do you go about redeeming your flawed characters?
Well, it's a combination of the plot. One thing I try to stay away from is having an ending where everything is perfect. So if somebody's had some kind of flaw, let's say from my book Wounds, where the guy's more than an introvert, he hides away except when he's teaching. That's the only thing he does in public. Then after that, it's to his condo or to his yacht. His yacht is big enough to sleep 2 people, so it's really just a little boat, but they're called yachts. So, but he doesn't like to be around people. Now he's forced to be around people. He has to act bravely when he's really a coward in every way. And when they get to the end of the book, I could not bring myself to have all those problems gone, and have him feeling 100% about himself now, and he's had this great epiphany, and everything's going to be good from now on. Life doesn't work that way. But I like in each case that they overcome whatever that flaw is to do something worthwhile, even if they have to continue to live with the flaw. And so in your case, with your first book, both your protagonist has several flaws that he has to put up with, that other people have to put up with too, that he meets other flawed people, and so he ends up making some very brave decisions against his nature. Not bravery in the sense of risking his life, but brave to face things he doesn't want to face, do things he doesn't quite believe in.
Yeah, and that was kind of I guess what Jennifer was talking about with the type 2 redemption, which would be the character arc, and I wanted him to have some growth. But I think you make a good point that it can sometimes come across as false if you have the happy ending, the perfect ending. And I think one of the ways that you can avoid that is to have them, have maybe a momentary redemption. Flannery O'Connor talks about the moment of grace, and that every character should have an opportunity for grace. There's a moment where they can redeem themselves, if you will, to where they can repent of their sins and fix their flaws, etc. But she says that they don't necessarily have to take that opportunity. They just have to have it presented to them. Somewhere in the text, something needs to happen to where they can redeem themselves. And I've always kind of really stuck with that. That's really resonated with me. I think of the show Monk. And in Monk, if you're familiar with it, the OCD detective who's got every phobia that's ever been listed. I think he's also afraid of being afraid. He's afraid of milk, this character, which I think is fantastic. And so in one scene, his aide, whose job is to help him get through the day because he can't even function in society on his own, his aide is on the rooftop wrestling with this bad guy. The bad guy has a gun. She's able to kind of get it away, but he's overpowering her. And Monk can't go out on the roof because he's terrified of heights. And so he's kind of watching them struggle, but he's also internally struggling with the fact that he has to go out and help her, but he can't because he's so afraid. And so eventually he is able to go out on the roof, and he helps in the struggle, and they overcome the bad guy. Hooray, hooray, hooray. And the first thing he does is he latches on to his helper named Natalie, latches onto her, and he says, "Can you please get me off the roof? Can you take me down now? I want to go down." And it's such a great moment for me because he's had a moment of redemption, but he hasn't necessarily completely conquered his fear. He hasn't completely overcome his flaw. His flaw is still present, but he had a moment to where he could be bigger than his flaw, and I think that was a really important character moment in the show, and it's one that's always stuck with me. So that's kind of the way I handle things, is I give them an opportunity for redemption. Some of the characters take it, some of them don't. And so I guess my next question would be, when you're looking at these moments of redemption, are you trying to tie it to their flaws? Is it, I know, like in a character arc, is this like they have to overcome their flaws in order to resolve the conflict, or do you just have kind of the flaws are more secondary to the primary conflict? Jennifer, how do you handle that? Do you make sure that the redemption is tied to the flaw of the character?
Well, I think, again, looking at it as two types of redemption. One is making the character likable by giving them some sort of either redeeming qualities or helping us understand their flaws. I don't think that needs to be tied to their flaws necessarily. If you're increasing the reader's sympathy for them by making the character very passionate about something, or making the character very good at something, it doesn't have to be tied at all to their flaws. But if you're looking at character arc and redemption of some flaw, then I think that they're inseparable. But again, it doesn't have to be a huge. I don't think it has to be a huge change. I think it can be a incremental change. But I do think that they need to overcome their flaw in order to move the plot along, or I think to give a satisfying ending.
Okay, excellent. How about you, Pops? Do you tie the redemption to the flaw of the character in like all of your books, some of your books?
In some I do. It depends how integral the flaw is to the story. Sometimes people just have faults they're going to live with. In fact, you don't want to fix them. Bringing Up Monk was brilliant because it also showed how the writers balanced that by providing an aid for him, which is not unusual. Sherlock Holmes needs Dr. Watson. He's just too big a pain in the butt as it is. Nobody likes him, so someone has to temper him and guide him, and it turns out to be Dr. Watson, and that theme has been used over and over and over again through literature because we all need a little help. So sometimes that's the thing to do, is to have someone help them along. Now, if you're writing a series, you may want to keep some of those faults around. So Monk would be another one, Sherlock Holmes another one. There's a great many partners in crime, Agatha Christie's Partners in Crime from the 1920s, husband and wife doing spy work and detective work that they don't know how to do. And that's really their flaw. They love fun too much and they don't know how to do what they're doing, but they do it anyway. Somehow they always succeed with it. You want to keep some of those things around. So in series, I would be slow to solve a characteristic flaw. But if there is a particular kind of flaw that the person's struggling with, then it might be wise to go ahead and solve that in the resolution.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. So I guess one other question would be, is it mandatory for characters to be redeemed? I like what you say, Pops, because you say in a series you can leave some of those flaws around, and that's important because the character arc there goes beyond just the single novel. It goes through several of them. But if we're writing a standalone, do we absolutely have to redeem our characters? Is there a method that you follow, Pops, for that?
No, I don't think you absolutely have to do that. It needs to be realistic. It has to have the ring of truth to it. And if you don't have that ring of truth to it, then the readers will be disappointed in the end. So it's not unusual not to solve every problem. You have to solve the plot problem. Otherwise, it won't be a satisfying ending. But you can't always solve every problem. And when you're, especially with a protagonist, your primary character, you have to ask yourself, what image do you want to leave of that protagonist in the minds of the reader? What do you want the reader to think about when they think about that person? And a really good character, you'll wonder how they're doing. Have they fully solved that problem? Did they carry on? And how great it was that they overcame whatever that was holding them back. But nonetheless, they still have their problem that they have to deal with. So, no, I don't think solving it every time is good, and probably it's bad.
Okay, interesting. Jennifer, do you agree with that? That solving it every time can sometimes be a drawback, or do you feel that every standalone novel needs to have that kind of neat, tidy character arc where the flaw of the character is redeemed?
I think characters need to have a character arc, but I don't think it necessarily needs to relate to their flaw. I think sometimes they can grow in some way, realize something, have a change in situation. And I think one exception to that is classic detective fiction. Usually the detective doesn't have an arc. But now, I think now the standards sort of changed in mystery writing, and the detective often changes within the course of a book, even if it's just a small change or some small realization. But it doesn't mean that, if you have an alcoholic character, it doesn't mean they kick the bottle. It may just be something they realize in the relationship with their kid or something. So I think character arcs make us. I just think they're more satisfying. So that's my opinion.
I agree with that, and I come from a literary background, and so for me, I feel very much like like you don't have to resolve the character flaw, that they don't necessarily have to have a character arc. If you read Raymond Carver's work, his early work, not a lot of character arc there. The characters are usually drunk and moaning about love at the beginning, and at the end they are drunker and still moaning about love. But there's some beauty in there with that. His later work, specifically Cathedral, you really get to see a character arc, and there's this epiphany that the character has, and some of his flaws are, I guess, redeemed toward the end, and it's a really beautiful kind of a change that I found very satisfying, very hopeful. But it's a very different reading experience than reading something like Popular Mechanics or A Small Good Thing, where you're left with this kind of dark, oppressive kind of a feeling. When you say, Jennifer, that it's more satisfying, I think especially for commercial readers, genre readers, who are expecting the happy ending, they want that character arc. There's something in us that likes to see the plot arc and the character arc come together, weave together, and resolve together. There's a certain beauty in that, a certain satisfaction in that. And again, if you're writing a standalone, that's awesome. But if you're writing a series, you do have to be aware that your character arc is going to go for several books, in the same way that your plot arc is going to go for several books. So you, again, want to be aware of your audience. It's totally fine if you want a literary audience to not have the happy ending, to not have the character be redeemed. Jennifer, you mentioned in the notes Everything That Rises Must Converge by Flannery O'Connor. And when I read that, when I read what she said about every character needing to have a moment of grace, and then I look at her stories like Revelation, Everything That Rises Must Converge, A Good Man Is Hard to Find, Good Country People, all of my favorites, The Life You Save May Be Your Own, all of these terrible, awful, crooked characters, very flawed characters, have moments, opportunities for redemption and for grace, and I think all of them walk away from it. I don't think any of them actually embrace it and actually become better people. You might argue that you'll find some of those characters in The Violent Bear It Away, but I don't think you see it in Wiseblood either. So I think her characters more often than not walked away from that redemptive moment, and I still love the stories. But again, I think a lot of people would be very critical of it, and I've written some stories where people have been critical of the ending because I had characters that did not redeem themselves completely. I do want to talk about one other thing, but Pops, I'll let you weigh in here on that, or I guess you already have, haven't you, about whether the character should be redeemed or not.
Yes, already did.
Yeah. So I'll talk real quick, and I don't want to take up the entire show here, and this is going to feel incredibly narcissistic, but I'm going to cite some of my work here, and it's from a short story called An Affair to Forget, or in the bargain it appears as Leaving Tennessee. And in that you've got a character who is a minister. He's had a child out of wedlock. He's had an affair and had a child and has never told his wife about it. And so the entire story takes place through some flashbacks, but the whole story takes place from the time that he goes to pick up his daughter, whose mother has died. So he's picking up his daughter from Tennessee. He's flying back out to California. He's driving home from the airport, and he's trying to figure out how he's going to tell his wife, who's very mentally fragile, that he's had an affair and he had a daughter. And there's a lot of things going on. But what I think was interesting about the redemption here is I don't think that I really allowed the character himself to be redeemed through his own actions, if that makes sense. Instead, it's the wife who has a redemptive moment, and it's kind of unexpected, and I think it's one of the reasons that it's one of my favorite endings that I've ever written, is because his moment of grace came from the least likely source, the place he least expected to find it. And so in some way, it's actually her that's redeeming him and not himself. So I don't know. I feel like I'm talking too much.
You
Somebody
know,
say something.
I love that. I mean, and what I love about that is the whole idea of being surprised by grace from someone else. Sometimes I don't. I can appreciate, but I don't enjoy books that are too cynical about human nature. So that sounds like I would really like that story.
Well, I got my only one-star review on that on An Affair to Forget on Amazon, and I don't think she really understood what was going on. I think she wanted some steamy romance, as the title would suggest. So I can't fault her for that. But I think she missed that subtlety at the end that I was going for. But and that's something that we didn't really talk about, though. Is, are the characters expected to redeem themselves? I don't know, Pops. What do you think? Do the characters have to redeem themselves, or can their redemption come from an outside source?
Again, I think it's going to depend on the story. The most satisfying ending is where there is a character arc and the character somehow grows. But we have to be careful in thinking that fiction has rules. It doesn't. It has guidelines. It's got markers along the way. We know what works, but it doesn't mean that you have to do it that way every time. And sometimes the story says, let's do things a little different. And when you do, you occasionally get criticisms for it. I did a book called Dark Moon, where some of the action takes place on the moon. Well, I can't put any of my characters on the moon. There's a red spot that appears and it grows, and then that has an effect. And in the end, the red spot goes away. And I got letters saying, well, what happened? Who made it go away? And I had to write back, so, beats me. We didn't have anyone there. There was no way to find out. And so I stayed true to the truth, but it seemed unsatisfying to others who come to think that every book must have a solid resolution every time. And it's probably best that it does most of the time, but there are stories where that just doesn't apply. And your twist ending on that one, I think, is great. It works, and you were doing a literary approach on it anyway, so you've got a little more elbow room there than, say, what we have in some of the genre fiction. So,
yeah. Okay. And Jennifer, what about you? Do you feel like you need to have the characters redeem themselves, or you kind of agree with Pops? It depends on the story.
I agree with him that sort of different rules apply when you're writing genre fiction and literature, and of course those lines blur. And I think the more masterful you are at your craft, the more you can get away with. As sort of a beginning author, I don't know. I mean, again, my stories are very organic, so I don't, even though I might sort of outline a little bit, I don't necessarily think all of this through. I just let it come out and then maybe think and adjust. But my character, I suppose she redeems herself in the sense that she's very self-centered, she's very narcissistic, and yet she comes to a place where she can risk her own life to save other people, but she's still narcissistic, she's still, her flaws remain through. She's still the same person at the end of the book. She's grown a little bit, but I think she redeems herself in the eyes of the reader because she shows a little virtue to balance out these flaws. And I think that had to come from inside of her to make a satisfying genre fiction ending.
Well said. I think I like the way you say redeems herself in the eyes of the reader, and that's ultimately the goal here. Is again, the reader is the heart and the soul. That's what we're aiming for here, is to not necessarily to please the reader, but to satisfy the reader and meet their expectations, and sometimes to challenge their expectations. True, but I think that, like you say, it's in the eyes of the reader. It depends on the story. Very well said. So that is what we have for our episode tonight. So before we start signing off, Pops, did you have anything else, or Jennifer, anything last minute questions, comments, or concerns?
Well, let's just look at what the room has been talking about. It's been an active room tonight. Um, I'm laughing because Tessa Group reminds us of Somerset Maugham's statement. There are 3 rules for writing a novel. Unfortunately, no one knows what they are. I always get a chuckle when I read that. She also mentions what she calls a foil character, which is a new phrase to me. Like Natalie, Dr. Watson, etc., are sometimes the more interesting characters, and that's true, and I think Tess will appreciate this because I know she's a Clive Cussler fan. I get very tired in the early books of Clive Cussler because the protagonist, Dirk Pitt, was perfect all the time, always got the woman, always won the fist fight. But later, as Clive Cussler grew as a writer, that changed. We got to see some different facets and insights, and the books became, I think, even more interesting at that point. Tess also mentions that when you describe the flaw changing during the story arc, reminds her of the hero's journey. Those not familiar with the hero's journey, it's a technique of writing, a way a character moves through a story. And I'm trying to see if we have any others here.
She also
Aaron wants to
mentioned
know why I dropped out, and it's just my internet carrier for some reason has been dropping me for a few minutes every time. It just reboots the modem, and I think that's probably it, unless I'm just overlooking something here, and I apologize if I am. So, so the last part for me, I will have a blog post up on Blue Ridge Mountain Christian Writers Conference.com, which is brmcwc.com. That's how you get there, or my-cwc. There's a number of ways of getting there. And I'll be talking about numbers. Some interesting numbers came out regarding reading and how much content is put up on the internet every day. It's astonishing how much content is put up every day. So stop over there and give it a little read. It's 500 words or so, so it shouldn't take you too long.
Excellent, thanks. Yeah, Tess also mentions way down in the room, I noticed earlier, about when I said, being a murderer is a bad character flaw, and she immediately pointed out Dexter. And so, for every rule, there's always there's an exception, and that is an exception there. But I think some of those rules, guidelines, are good for us to be able to challenge some readers or challenge our audience at times. So, Jennifer, thank you for joining us. Can you tell people how they can get in touch with you, how they can get a hold of your book,
Sure.
etc.?
So I just wanted to mention I was really glad I just got a starred review from Booklist, and for The Secret Life of Anna Blanc, and RT Book Reviews said it was a Agatha Christie meets I Love Lucy adventure. So it's different, but it's coming out in a week, and you can find it anywhere. But if you Google my name, it's an unusual name, or if you Google the name of my book, my website pops up. It's jenniferkincheole.com.
And spell the last name, because a lot of people will listen to this on audio only. They won't see the video.
Sure. Kincheole. So it's Jennifer and Kincheole, Kincheole. And I also want to mention my Facebook page, because my book's set in 1907 Los Angeles, and I post pictures from the period, and I have a pretty big following. So if people are interested in that, then again, just Google the name of my book and it'll pop up.
Well, they had pictures in 1907?
Yes, they did.
Are those just like sketches, like police sketches? No, all right.
Cave paintings.
There you go. So, and thanks again for joining us. Really appreciate it. Next week, we will be talking about Team Writer, talking about co-writing books, and that's a topic that we discussed a while back and thought we might revisit it, Pop, since you have done so much co-writing, and so we'll see if we can maybe find a good guest to join us and share with us as well. But we do thank you all for listening. Oh, wait. And you can find me at aarongansky.com. You can find us find me on the Facebook and on the Twitter and all of that. So would love to talk to you guys. Thank you all for listening. And until next week, good writing.
Thank you.